Hey guys, how's it going? My name's Ian, I'm the owner-operator of Wheel Every Weekend. I specialize in performance suspension. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how to rebuild King's 2.5 Series 3.2 bypasses. We're going to go over rebuilding it. We're going to take this thing completely down to its base components. We're going to put brand new seals in. Everything is going to get new seals, new oil, pressurize it. I'm going to show you guys how to do all that. We're going to talk a little bit about valving. I'm going to explain how a bypass actually works. So we have a pretty big agenda today, so I think we got to just get straight into it. All right, first things first, let's look at all the different components. This is the actual bypass part of the bypass. This is what makes it bypass. This is the internal floating piston. This separates the oil from the nitrogen in the reservoir. King uses a plastic wear band and pretty standard O-ring on it. This is a nice piece. It's got a threaded end, which is great for bleeding it. Here's your other bypass tube parts. Bunch of C-clips. You got your reservoir end cap. Has the same kind of style O-ring as the IFP has. I always take the reservoirs and everything completely apart because I replace every single seal when I'm doing a rebuild. Just kind of by standard. There's no point in taking a shock apart and only replacing half of it. You gotta be able to get this O-ring and everything else. Here's the main body. See, it's piggyback style, so the reservoir is actually attached to the shock there. You can also notice that, like this guy, compared to this guy, they're actually mirror images of each other. And the reason being is so that these can mount on either side of the vehicle and have the bypass tubes be in the correct orientation. Here's this main assembly. You got your main valving here and your piston. I want to say is just King standard high flow piston. Usually these just have 12s on either side, but we'll dig into that. You got a little spacer. Here's your main seal assembly. You got your wiper seal, your little bottom out like oh shit thing. And Kings are nice because they have an O-ring on the actual outer wiper assembly. And what that does is it stops, like some overlanders will drive into the ocean and then seawater gets in between there and kind of like totally chowders this, makes it hard to get apart. Anyways, it's a nice little touch. So let's pull one of these apart. First things first, we're going to take our shock and put it in the vise. I'm just going to use these little mountain bike frame pads. These things have magnets on the back. They're super simple. I think they're like 15 bucks on Amazon. I'll leave a link to them in the description. But they work awesome for this. I never open a shock that's pressurized, and I always take out the Schrader valve every single time I'm about to open a shock because you can accidentally open one that is pressurized and then, well, you're gonna get 200 PSI oil everywhere, which is gonna be no fun. I like this, look at this too. Wow, do you see all that? That's just oil leaking out of the reservoir, so that's not really a good sign. Wow. That's not supposed to happen. All right, well, we're 5 seconds in and the entire floor is already covered in oil, so we're off to a good start. First thing you're gonna do is loosen the set screw here. All it's doing is it's holding it so that this cap cannot spin. It's a 3/32 hex. Fox uses 3/32 on a lot of their stuff too. Bilstein's metric and they'll have 3 set screws. Their stuff isn't screwed on usually. You're going to take a spanner wrench such as this, plop it in there, and then usually just a tap with the hammer. And your wiper assembly will spin right off. Now you can see under here, this is the main seal head assembly versus the wiper assembly. Your wiper is kind of like your windshield wiper almost. It's to scrape like mud and rocks and dirts and stuff off. But inside here, these are the seals that are actually going to keep the oil in the shock and atmosphere out. In order to get the seal head assembly out, this thing actually has to push down far enough that we can pull the C-clip out. So all I'm going to do is just use my fingers and try and just push it down, which doesn't always work. So if it doesn't, you can just smack the rod end with a hammer. And all that's going to do is create a little bit of negative pressure behind the seal head assembly and then pull it down. Just like that. Now in here, there's a C-clip. Just gonna pull it out real quick. That's all it looks like, and that's what's stopping the seal head assembly from coming out. This is screwed into it so that as the shaft moves, this seal head assembly doesn't try and suck in if the pressure is overcome on this bottom side of the piston. Now we're just going to pull this whole thing out. I'm just going to lift it straight out of the shock. You can see there's a seal head assembly. You hear that? The piston's pretty hard to move in this bottom section because there aren't any bypass tubes and you're already past the reservoir port. So it's like all oil pressure and there's only one tiny bleed hole in these bypass main pistons. Come on. Let it drain into the shock itself for a little bit. Set it on the table. Now we're just going to drain the shock out. This oil actually doesn't look that bad. If you were smart, you would have a screen that covers your bucket, so if anything falls in right now, you can easily retrieve it, but I'll leave a link to that too. I don't have one. I left it at another shop while I was rebuilding shocks for them. So I'll sit here and let it drain for a little bit. Now we have the shock split into its two basic components. We got the outside bits and the inside bits. So you can tackle whichever one you want first. For no particular reason, let's do the inside bits first, then I'll let this drain a little more. So for the shaft, we have a couple main components. This is the tenon. It's a 5/8 tenon on this, so it's a 15/16 stud. There's a spacer. This is your rebound valving, your main piston with its wear band, your compression valving. There's like a little washer there. This is just a little spacer. I'll explain why they have that. And then this is the main seal head assembly. This is the wiper seal. This is that bottom mount stopper. So come through, whiz this guy off real quick. Easy as that. And then you're going to pull everything off, and you want to put it in exactly the order that it came off in. This is a good practice to do it every single time so you're not making mistakes. So that's the rebound valving. You want to take the piston, set it the same exact side up that it came out. I'll explain to you how to tell which way the piston goes a little later on. And then you're going to lay out the compression valving. And then you can just continue it on the next line. You got a washer, you got your little aluminum spacer, here's your main seal assembly, your wiper assembly, and that's as far as I'm going to break this shock down. So the first thing that I do when I'm taking a shock apart is I'll double check that the valving is correct. You guys don't have to, but I have seen some really weird stuff. And these things actually don't feel like 12s, so I might have been lying to you guys earlier. Yeah, so it's got, what's that look like? It's got 10s on the rebound side. Usually on these bypasses, all the shims will be the same size. And then the compression side actually felt thick. I think these are like 15s maybe. Yep. Looks like 15. That's weird. The last like 5 I've taken apart just had 12s on both sides. So, let's talk about the piston. This is King's high flow linear style piston. This thing is pretty good. You can see these holes are going down to the compression ports. These are the rebound ports. Typically on the rebound side, it'll be at least smaller and usually a different shape, or there will be less ports. So you can see on this compression side that there's a ton more ports, so it's going to flow more oil. So people will compensate for that. The reason people do that is because compression events are typically much faster than rebound events. Rebound is just resisting spring force really. Compression is actually trying to like soak up what you're hitting. So that's the reason for the discrepancy there. So you can have, say, this piston, if you had 12,000 shims on either side, it would generate a ton more force on the rebound side because the ports are much smaller. And so it's going to be harder for that hydraulic oil to take this shim and initially lift it off so it can start like kind of free flowing out there. Hopefully that makes sense to you guys. Let's talk about these seal housings real quick. This is King's kind of like standard off-road, like, I don't know what these are called, the Performance Series or whatever. They're the ones that don't go on race trucks pretty much. but this is their standard seal pack for that. So I have this little spacer here, which then holds in this U-cup style wiper seal. See, it's a U-style wiper seal. Set that aside. And then inside of this seal assembly itself, there's also an O-ring. Let's pull that out real quick. This clear O-ring here. And that comprises pretty much most of the two main seals in this thing. There's also this outer seal here. And all this guy does is it stops oil from coming out and mixing with atmosphere or getting atmosphere in your oil. There'll be 4 of these kinds of seals included in your rebuild kit, and most shocks will replace all of them. So that's this seal head assembly taken completely apart. Now to do the wiper seal, we gotta go to the other table. My bad, just got junk. So this is that wiper seal, right? This thing is actually kind of like pressed in here. Not really pressed, but kind of pressed. So all I do is I get a socket that fits the center diameter, hold it over a socket, and just tap it out real quick. Easy as that. You see that's what you're left over with. So now let's get this main wiper seal. I usually get my seal kits from the manufacturer, but lately I've been getting them from shockseals.com. It's a local guy to me. These things don't even get on a freeway to get here. He's just down the hill from me, and really good dude, really good prices, and the rebuild kits come with everything you need to rebuild even a bypass shock. You don't need like a specific rebuild kit, so it just takes a lot of the guesswork out of it, and the pricing is really competitive compared to the OEM manufacturer's rebuild kits, and the seals are guaranteed to be at least as good as the OEM quality. In my experience, usually the seals are a little better. I'm not sure where he sources them, but keep that in mind. So I usually just go through, I'll separate out all the seals. These are like the typical ones that come in. So I like to lay these out before I actually start. That way I know that I have all the seals. These are the little seals for the actual bypass tubes. These are kind of like your main seals that you're worried about. These will go in the reservoir, the IFP, etc. These seals are for different kinds of shocks that would also be 2.5s that maybe have smaller reservoirs, like on a Toyota 4Runner rear end or otherwise. And then I'm not honestly sure what some of these are for. I only use like 1 or 2 of these, and I haven't found the use for them yet, but I'm sure I will at some point. So these are the 3 seals that we are concerned with. This is one of the easier ways to do this. All King seals are really easy to install. The only thing you have to be worried about is if this kind of like goes in crooked to begin with. But I usually just go like this. I push it against that side of the vise. Start to tighten it with it all the way on. And then I'll start it like that, just a little. You can see it usually starts crooked. Turn it 90 degrees, tighten the vise a little, and then I'll do the same thing, just kind of turning it while I go. And eventually it tends to just sort itself out, man. And you get to a point where you know it's going in straight, you can just pull it in. There we go. And just like that, the new seal is installed. You want to check and make sure it's flush. Look on the back, make sure that there's no air in between the seal and the aluminum housing. Now I'm just going to go ahead and pop off this O-ring right here. A lot of these lower grade shocks won't have an O-ring that actually stops like salt water or whatever from getting in here. So it's kind of nice that they include it, even though this is like their cheap model of shock, you know. And so that's this outer wiper seal fully put together. We're going to put the new O-ring on. I know which one it is, but if you don't, you need to take the old O-ring, the new O-ring. You want to look at them and compare them side by side. Make sure that they're the same thickness and the same diameter. You can do that by just pulling them between your fingers, and they both should pull at the same time. And then what you want to do is take the old one in your left hand, always use your left hand for the old one, and throw it away. Otherwise, you'll just put the old one on and you won't know. One of the things you're going to see me do is I go through and clean pretty much every piece that comes out of a shock, because even just one little speck of dirt can like pretty much completely ruin a damper. So you want to make sure that you're really careful about not having any weird intrusions into the shock itself. So I'll go through and just clean this main assembly. Now I do the U-cup seal. All you're going to do is literally just push it in. It won't quite go in right. It's going to get stuck in one spot. You just come with a flat head, work it all the way in flat. Put this little top spacer dongle back on, and that's pretty much it. I'm also going to put this. This is one of the fat O-rings. This guy will be on this. It'll be on your IFP, and it'll be on your reservoir. You want to just slide it over the top. That's a whole new O-ring. So that seal head assembly is ready to go now. Dang, and just like that, we're pretty much ready for reassembly. What I am gonna do is take this thing over to my fixture table, and I'm gonna lay it flat on the table and just roll it a couple times to make sure that it's straight. Try and stick feeler gauges under it. It honestly looks pretty straight, and it's not damaged at all. If it is damaged, I will typically go through, there's a little bit of like overspray on it, I might anyways. I'll go through with a 3-stage buff on this. It's like a specific buff that I use for shock shafts, and it'll just kind of like clean up all this grit and make sure that it's nice and good to go for the customer. Now you want to put things back on in the same exact order they came off in. First guy being this outer wiper cap. King shafts are actually slightly beveled at the end, so you don't necessarily need a little seal spacer like this guy. This is for Fox shocks that have very, very hard edge on them. So it'll expand the seal so it slides smoothly over it and doesn't scratch it. Those are worth it if you're working on a shock that isn't built like this, but see, just slips right on, super nice. Do the same thing with the seal head assembly. You remember, it's gonna go like this. And now we can just put our little aluminum spacer on. We'll put our washer back on top, and then we're gonna put the valving on. The reason I clean every single piece of valving is because imagine 1/1000th worth of dirt gets stuck in between the shims. Well, it can jack up the seals, but also it's gonna apply preload to this initial valve stack. And what that'll do is it'll change the rate. So you can actually take a linear shock and bring it into a like digressive territory just by having it dirty. Now you're going to put the piston on. You can see there's only one tiny bleed hole on this piston, which isn't typical for King, but that's because it's a bypass shock. So the bypass tubes are creating that bleed, which gives you that kind of like progressive feel that everybody likes or dislikes about King shocks. So you know that this top part is where the rebound valving is going to go. This bottom part is where the compression valving is going to go. And so we're just going to plop it on like that. Now I'm going to clean off the rebound valving. Now here's the spacer. All it does is take up room where there isn't threads. That way you can have multiple different valve assemblies on this pretty much. And then you're going to put the nut on. One of the things I like to do with both the nut and the threads is I make sure that they're both dry before I actually put anything on them. One of my pet peeves is seeing people take threads that are covered in hydraulic oil and then apply a substance to them, and then they wonder why they've backed off immediately, and it's because the hydraulic oil is reacting with it. And in this case, that substance is Loctite 271. A little dab will do you. And then we're going to put this nut on. So I do have one of these fancy rod holders. These things are pretty sick. I use this a lot. You can buy them on my website. Please buy them from me. But honestly, if you're just going to rebuild one shock, don't buy them. Just do this. Chuck this rod end in the vise like that. That'll stop it from spinning. Be able to torque the top. Spec on this bad Larry, I believe, is 50 foot-pounds. Helps the table doesn't move. Just like that, good to go. So check it out, that's a whole brand new assembly. We replaced every single O-ring, every single seal on this thing, and we torqued the nut back to spec, cleaned all the valving off. We still have this volume spacer on here. I guess I'll explain what the volume spacer does. So there's a couple different reasons for having these spacers. One of the most obvious ones is ease of machining. You can make one shock, just use spacers to change it to a bunch of different sizes for a bunch of different applications. But another reason it's here is imagine that this thing is fully topped out, right? This shaft is all the way out. Well, underneath the piston, there's going to be a certain amount of oil here. And as this piston initially tries to travel up, what'll happen is if there isn't enough oil here, it'll pull a negative pressure vacuum on the back end, and it has this weird kind of like suction thing that happens as the shock transitions from piston all the way topped out to trying to then maybe landing a jump or something and shoving it back in. Some shocks just straight up don't have this. I don't know how much that actually matters, and to be totally honest, I haven't really seen an example of it firsthand, so I'm just telling you what someone else told me, I guess. Let's take the bypass itself apart. It has a couple main components. You got all the adjusters inside their tubes, and you got the reservoir that we're gonna pop off. So the way I pop off the reservoir is I have a nice little tool that's threaded for this fitting, which is super sick. But if you don't have one of those, you can take a Schrader valve like this, drill a hole in the end. I've already mentioned this guy's got a hole in it, so it doesn't create a pressure vacuum in here as you try and push it in. But yeah, you do that, drill a hole in the end, grab this thing with some dang old pliers, tap it in, pull it out, and you can do it without the special tool. But if you're gonna do more than like a couple shocks, highly recommend you just buy one. It make your life a little easier. And there, that just pushes in. Everything, I think you're gonna see a common theme here where everything's kind of held together the same way. And we're just gonna fish this C-clip out. Freaking rusted, wow. I'm not sure why the C-clip looks like it's lived at the bottom of the ocean for a couple years. Sometimes they're just like this. Now I'm gonna blow out all this debris and then I'll just pop this thing out. So, excuse me one sec. I'm really not sure if you guys just don't think I'm cool or something, but clearly there's a whoop section at the bottom of the ocean that everybody's hitting and no one will tell me about. There we go. It takes some force, but it does come out. You can put a little bit of grease on it, which will help it pop out. And then inside of there, now we're just gonna pop this hose clamp off real quick. Just like that. Again, easy peasy. There we go. I have a threaded tool to grab onto that threaded section of the IFP I was showing you guys earlier. If you don't have this, you can just take a 3/8 bolt and grab onto it with like some long pliers. But having the tool is nice. So I'll just take that and then pull the IFP out. This is how the IFP looks. I know I showed you guys earlier. Plastic wear band, same O-ring that goes on like the end cap assemblies. So that's right there. And then we're gonna take this reservoir, since we've taken the hose clamp off, we can just tap the end down with a hammer, and that will expose this C-clip. So we'll just pop this C-clip out and then pull the whole assembly off. There's this C-clip off. And here's the reservoir popped off, so we can get to that final seal. When I'm taking tubes apart, I'll always lay them out in order because I want to keep the same amount of adjustment that the customer had on it before. So typically what I'll do is I'll do rebound, and then I'll do compression from short to high. And then that just helps you keep it kind of like oriented correctly. And then you aren't, like say this rebound tube is 7 clicks in, and then this is like 20 clicks in, and you swap them, this whole tune is gonna be jacked up. If these are even tuned, which I don't think they are. I'm just gonna whiz these off an impact. The first section of the bypass tube that's actually gonna come out, you can just use some like little needle nose pliers and pull them out. And it looks like this. All this is a plunger that this guy is gonna actuate. And this is right here is what's actually applying preload to the spring inside of the shock. So this little guy right here is what makes a bypass shock actually bypass. And what's happening is, as this piston is going up and down through the body, normally oil would be forced through the valving in here, but these have directional ports in them that allow some of the oil to bypass the main piston and flow around into this little check valve thing here. So all this looks like is you have your end. This has a plunger on it, which actually pushes onto this piece, which is what adjusts the amount of preload on your spring, which is here. So this piece is pushing on this piece, and you can use that to change the preload. You can see there's quite an adjustment on this screw. So you got that guy here, and then King's like normal series bypasses use a little plastic check valve to reduce noise. All this little check valve has to do is really just open enough that it's letting oil flow through ports, which are in this little TIG welded boss right here. So just to drive the point home, here's your main piston. You see this valving. On the compression stroke, this piston is coming up the shock body like that. And you can see that as long as that main piston is in between the ports that are drilled into the body here and the ports here, not all the oil has to flow through the piston. In fact, the oil can bypass the main piston valving, come through this hole in the body out here to this guy, which is that little like one-way check valve plunger setup. I'm not sure what it's called. And then on the other side, coming back, this is why it's a one-way check valve, because otherwise oil would just flow freely through here and you'd have no adjustment. You can see that this is just a compression tube, but backwards, which makes it a rebound tube. So as the piston is coming back out, oil is going to flow through there to the check valve, same exact thing. So it's a pretty elegant solution to a complex problem, which I like. So here are your four main components. You got your little plastic plunger, one-way check valve thing. You got your spring that goes behind the plunger. This is your little adjusty bit. It has like a little rubber bit on this end. And then this bit is what actually does the adjustment as it pushes down on it. So we're just going to go through and swap out all these O-rings. This O-ring on this blue aluminum piece, the outer one, this is just going to stop like oil from getting out and mixing with atmosphere. Although no oil should really get past these seals here, which are going to do the bulk of the sealing effort. The kit comes with new ones. They go on exactly how you'd think they would. So now that we're actually ready to assemble things back in here, we have them laid out in the correct orientation. I know this is the short tube compression side. I put new O-rings off this. I just realized I didn't film it, but you guys know how to put O-rings on stuff. And we're just going to put everything back in the same way it came out. This guy indexes onto the spring like that, so you can't really put it in the wrong way. It'll just go in, bloop. This guy, I do like to put just a dab of grease on this O-ring because it's got to slide over threads, and I just don't want it to immediately cut this. You don't need that much though. And since this part can move with the adjusters, so you can kind of just push it in by hand. And then this guy, you don't need to put anything on the threads. These are non-sealing threads. You can tell because it has an O-ring and the threads aren't tapered and there's no like angled seat or anything. So there you go. Just screw this thing in all the way, torque it to spec. I think the spec is 15 foot-pounds, but I'll double check. I'll put it in the comments. And that's one bypass tube with all new seals. You do have to pressurize this to set this initial piece, because right now it's going to be down a little further than it wants to be. So I'm going to show you how to bleed it, pressurize it. That'll push it back up and get you your correct like oil fill volume, and just make sure there's no air inside of this adjuster area, which is super common on these. Now that all the adjusters are back on, we're just going to pop the reservoir back on real quick. So this guy, you can just pull off with this handy little tool, clean this little blue aluminum piece while you have it out. And then I know this reservoir goes, I think the G faces down. This reservoir though is honestly kind of jacked, so I'm gonna spend a little bit to kind of like fix it. This bottom part isn't bad, but you can see this part, it's full of rust inside the C-clip groove, so I'm just gonna hit it with a little Scotch-Brite thingy. You can see it's kind of grody, so I'm gonna just dig in with my fingernails and try and get majority of that rust out. So you can see it's actually much better. It's at least down to bare aluminum in most of the spots. What I'll do is I'll go in, I'll coat this with grease, which will just provide a vapor barrier and it'll stop the chemical chain reaction so that the rust doesn't continue at least. New O-ring for the reservoir. The reservoir simply slides on like that. You're gonna slide it a little further than it actually needs to. Pop that C-clip on. And then pull it back out. Make sure the logo faces the right direction. And then I like to loosely put on the hose clamp at this time. It's my preference to kind of hide the end of the hose clamp. I just think it looks better. There. And at this point, you want the hose clamp loose enough that this thing can still slide a little bit when it gets pressurized, because it'll push against this bottom C-clip. Now we got to put the IFP back in the reservoir. I will go through and I'll clean the reservoir with a shop towel. I have like a little, this is from my old medical kit. Let's put a shop towel on it, clean it, and then you can inspect the inside of it and just see if there's any burrs or anything weird that's making it not seal correctly. But this thing looked fine. I think it just been too long without a rebuild, or maybe it was over pressurized or got too hot or something. I don't know. So after you fully clean the IFP, you can just throw a new main seal on it. You put a new wear band on it. When you're inserting the wear band, you're gonna have to kind of like pinch these two parts together. And that's just so this thing doesn't pop off and go in all crooked. Let's see if I can show that on video. There we go, I get it like started most of the way. And then pinch the plastic wear band together. And then slide in. You wanna make sure you don't leave any bits of your glove in here. I've seen like blue gloves stuck inside of this stuff. And there's your IFP. I'll start it out maybe fully bottomed, and then I'll pull it back like an inch or two, just so there's a little bit of oil volume for purging. So let's pop this thing in the vise. So now we got it back securely in the vise. All the bypass tubes are back on. We got the reservoir back on, the IFP is back on, but our end cap isn't on, and there's nothing actually inside of it. You wanna go through, check this thing, make sure that there's nothing weird with the inside body. You can visually inspect all the bypass tubes as well, make sure there's nothing weird going on. And then you really got to clean this thing out. I'll use a blower, like a little compressed air blower. I'll run it through with shop towels, and then I have some hones that I'll run through if there are any issues. They're very light hones though. They probably take off less than 1/1000 of an inch. So we want to fill this guy with oil just about to where the reservoir tube comes out, and put some in the reservoir tube. So you can see where I have the oil volume set right now, and that's because I have the internal floating piston an inch or two down. So we're going to push this thing back up, pull it out, just kind of initially bleed the reservoir section. Hopefully do it without getting oil all over the camera. Wouldn't that be nice? Try and go slow. So typically when I do that, I'll put a little shop towel over the top, because this thing has some stiction. It'll just explode oil at the top. I thought I could do it slow enough to not, but clearly not. So this time we'll just go like this. Yep, so that's good. And then you can pull some of the oil back into the IFP. Let's put that shop towel there. That, and you're just gonna work it back and forth a couple times. You don't want any these air bubbles to be coming out. Now let's assemble the rest of it. So right now we got oil to about here. We got our IFP fully bottomed out. We've cycled the IFP a couple times, try and get rid of some of those air bubbles, and we're ready to put the main piston in. So this guy has a little wear band on it. On these you don't really have to hold it closed, but still good practice. And you're just gonna work it into the cylinder. You want it to be fully submerged in oil. So actually I didn't fill this up with quite enough oil. Like that. And you want to work this IFP up and down a couple times, because there'll be some air caught in the valving, but we also have to work this up and down a couple times under pressure to actually set the bypass correctly. All right. You see that? See all this oil coming out now? That's how I know that this thing has actually been fully purged of air correctly. I'm just going to put the C-clip back in real quick. And then pull back up on it to set the seal head. Then you're gonna spin this little blue guy on. On Kings, you do kind of have to spin this on because if you pressurize it, you can shoot out that seal with its weird little spacer thing. So you wanna get this guy just like kind of snug. That should be good. Now we're ready to initially pressurize it, and then we'll cycle the shock so that we can bleed it. Pull that guy out. Here's this end cap. We're going to clean this up, put a new seal in it. Pull that seal off. Get it nice little cleaned. Throw a new seal on it. Pop it in the end. Give it a quick little tap. Should go right in to there. We're going to put a C-clip on it. And then I pulled the reservoir out all the way. We're going to unscrew our tool. I'm not going to put a Schrader valve in it just yet. I'm actually going to pressurize it. And I want you guys to hear something. Let's see if it'll work. So I have this nice little like no loss Schrader valve tool from Power Tank. I think you guys hear me rave about this in every video. So we're gonna put it on, and then I'm gonna take one of my gloves off so I can show this. Let's see if you guys can hear this. I don't know if that came through. There were a couple distinct clicks, and what it is that's little like initial dual O-ring adjuster thing is getting fully seated out. And so that'll help you set your specified oil depth, and it'll help get rid of whatever's going on in here. There's probably a bunch of air stuck in these tubes right now. So I've initially pressurized it to 200. That's really just to set these bypass tube little adjusty bits in the right spot. I'm gonna go through and tighten this hose clamp now, because with pressure on this whole reservoir is going to be pushing out all the way. You don't want to go too tight on this because it can actually dent the aluminum, which, well, the IFP should never get to here, but it's just a bad idea. Now I'm going to bleed a little bit of this pressure off until it's at about 10 psi. There we go, that's about 10. Now what we have to do is we have to kind of like exercise these adjusters a little bit. It's only at 10 psi, and what you want to do is move the shaft fast enough that these bypass adjusters will actually move, and what that'll do is it'll force all the air out into this main air like oil column and then allow you to bleed it. Can you hear all the air that's in there? I have a jig for doing this, but it's pretty hard to film when it's in it. All right. Run it through one more time. I'm not gonna go down all the way because, man, that rebound zone is firm. Pull it back up. You can hear a decent amount of the air is coming out. Just pressurize it fully to get it extended. And then we'll take this thing out one more time. You want to cycle this maybe 10 or 15 times, I'd say. That'll probably get most of the air out. You see how foamy that is? That's what would have been in your brand new shock if you didn't put it together and pressurize it and work on it first. Because we have this end cap on, and just to save time, I'm going to reset the IFP depth by pressurizing this reservoir slightly. Only put like 5 pounds in it or something. I just want to make sure the IFP is fully bottomed before I put the seal head assembly in. And the seal head assembly will displace enough oil to set the IFP depth. Here we go. Cool. It's plenty. This thing is actually low on oil now, which is a good sign. That's what you want to see. Now that we fully exercised the bypass tubes, we can put this thing in for the last time. You can see it only has one bleed hole on this main piston, so a lot of oil is going to squirt out from right there. My advice to you is don't point that at your face, otherwise you get a mouthful of oil. Ask me how I know. Now to try and get all the oil out, you can exercise this main piston up and down a little bit. You want to make sure that there's no air caught inside of the valving. And you want to make sure that the entire time you're doing that, oil fully covers the piston. Otherwise, you kind of have to start over. You're pretty sure there's no air bubbles in. You can start to put this guy back on. And there we go. Pop this C-clip on for hopefully the last time. There it is. Pull this guy back up. Can slide this little wiper seal assembly back on. Take this guy off because now we're actually ready for the Schrader valve. Here's a Schrader valve. I use this Slime Schrader valve tool, which actually has a built-in torque wrench, which I really like so you don't over tighten them. It just goes in how a Schrader valve will go in. I'm assuming you guys don't need to be told how that goes. Hear those clicks, that's the torque wrench working. Then we're gonna pressurize it. All right, let's give it its final pressure. Bring it up to like 100, and I'll tighten this guy. I hate when the bypass tubes are adjusted like this because you can't just spin the spanner around 360 degrees. It's just annoying. This thing doesn't have to be super tight. Just give it a couple taps with a small hammer and you should be good. You'll go through and tighten this set screw. There's another thing that doesn't have to be super tight. If the set screw has a lot of oxidation and stuff on it, you can put like Vibratite on it or some product like that. I do like a quarter turn past tight. It's like over tightening them is so much worse than under tightening them. And there you go. I'll initially pressurize this shock to 250 PSI and then I'll let it sit overnight. I'll do a leak down test, come back the next morning and see what it's at. And if it's good, I'll drop it down back to 150 PSI and we'll send it. This thing is good. I'll put it in the parts washer right now and hopefully the customer will be happy with this thing for many years to come. So there we go. We got a fully rebuilt King 2.5 3-tube bypass. This thing, probably tomorrow morning, once I'm sure that this thing's passed this leak down test, we'll set the pressure back to 150 and then it'll be good for many more years of service. If you guys have any questions about this, feel free to just shoot a comment or send me an email, whatever you want. If you're interested in any of the products that I've used today, I do sell a lot of them. So here's a shameless plug. Check out my website, or I'm sure I'll put links in the video description. And yeah, that's all I got. These things, they aren't known for being like the absolute highest quality shock you can get, but man, are they easy to work on, right? Which I think is why they're such a crowd favorite. So, all right, bye.